Alright everyone, once in a while I like to just sort of make the rounds and see the crazy stuff that people are posting on like left-wing Twitter and stuff like that. And I arrived on Jared Holt's channel actually, and he was complaining to somebody who was talking about tech censorship. Well, why do you support capitalism then? Because capitalism is responsible for tech censorship. So I thought that I would lay the law down and explain why that's completely wrong. It's actually the inversion of capitalism happens in Silicon Valley and in the internet. Now there's the structural part, like the physical part of it, like Silicon Valley itself, buildings and people. And then there's the internet, the way the internet functions. Let's go to the latter first. The internet is not a capitalistic system anymore. It was. Up until a few years ago, it was very hyper-capitalistic. Now, though, what you have is a very small number of structures, Google, Apple, Amazon, so forth, that are gatekeepers to virtually all content. Because of their massive amount of money and power and their advertising networks, they are capable of making other sites do what they want to avoid conflict with them. And so any site that doesn't play nice and partner with them and basically do what they want, and they're modeling their systems after the European Union and the UN, not US law, which is a big problem, anyone who doesn't do that gets to platform. We've seen this before, like with Gab. Gab, essentially. People are like, well, you don't like the way that Twitter operates, make your own Twitter. They did that. Then they quickly realized they would need their own payment processor. Their payment processor got shut down. And now they've finally managed to obtain equilibrium, and the problem is now they face never-ending waves of propaganda by the same people that are partnered with those same corporate advertising firms. Lest we forget that Holt works for a company whose parent firm takes checks from the Open Society Foundation. Soros has money in Silicon Valley. Soros has money in the legacy media. It's all tied together. It's a corporate structure. It's corporatism. And there's where you get to the physical component off the internet itself. So the internet is massively dominated by a half a dozen companies. We'll stretch that out. About 100 or so firms partnered with them form the secondary cluster. That's 99% of all of the internet. If one of these groups decides they don't like you, the others seem to get it in their minds they don't like you either. And it isn't because of systemic behavior in all cases. Some of the people deplatformed have been mass deplatformed by large numbers of large companies in very short periods of time, indicating a centrality to the effort to deplatform them, an effort to defang them from responding, an effort to prevent them from defending themselves effectively from what amounts to defamation a la a modern-day baron system. You've heard of you've heard of the Gilded Age. You've heard of the robber barons. You've heard the steel barons, the train, monopolies, the trust era. And that's basically what we have when we look at the physical structure. We have a very small number of companies that control virtually all of the world's human communications. They act worse than the robber barons. If you adjust for inflation, if you adjust for the value of holdings and currency then and now, these companies dwarf at least the physical assets of any of the robber baron families. What happened back then, for those of you who didn't didn't like U.S. history, let me explain what the Gilded Age was all about. Industry rapidly spiraled across the United States in the wake of the 1860s. In the wake of the Civil War, the U.S. becomes an industrialized economy. Industry that had been smaller level, largely relegated to the East Coast, begins to spread west. They're building rail stations. They're extracting coal. They're building farms and company towns and stuff like that. Industry begins. Heavy industry in some cases. What happened was the concept of monopolies and trusts. Now, back then it was different because, of course, back then if you're traveling by horse and buggy or on foot or something, you probably very rarely leave your little town or village. You might be on the outskirts of a larger city. You might make that 10-mile trek in order to go shopping once a month and supply with your wagon or something. But other than that, for the most part, you stay home. So it's a little bit different. We didn't have the internet back then. What a trust is that a group of people, for instance, this was most famous with trains, with rail. What would happen is all the rail companies in the country, there weren't that many of them anyway, they had been competing. They got together, though, mob style, and smoked cigars and did laudanum and stuff, and they said, hey, we can make so much more money if we simply form a trust. And what that means is they would not compete with each other. They carved the U.S. apart into components. Each one had no competition within that component. They formed monopolies. It formed an oligarchic corporate system, plutocracy. They made lots of money. Because what happened? No safety regulations. There was no need to compete for safety. They didn't care if the rail car went off the rails, literally. Pardon the pun. The infrastructure, maintenance, who cares? As long as it keeps running at marginal safety levels, who gives a fuck? And so ticketing prices, they could jack those up. The only limit on the ticketing prices really was the ability of people to pay for them. And so they would have some squalor car that was cheaper for all the little people, and then, everyone else paid through the nose for the luxury of being semi-comfortable. And so there was no competition. Capitalism disappeared. It was explicitly anti-capitalistic. Now, if you read some Marxist history book, they will tell you that this is an essence of out-of-control capitalism. But it's not. It's simply the private marketplace spawning a cancer that roughly resembles a socialistic state, a highly centralized system. It has totally centralized. There is no competition. For capitalism to exist, you need competition. Essentially, at its purest form, capitalism is I go outside, I plant some crops, I harvest the crops, I eat or I trade or I sell the crops. I am getting the fruits of my productivity. If we look at the internet, that is no longer the way the way the internet worked 10 years ago was kind of like that. Back before we had essentially a trust system with these few dozen extremely large firms or a few hundred extremely large firms. They don't compete with one another. They buy one another up instead. It's not capitalism. Not in any essence. And by the way, they're all in California. They're overwhelmingly staffed by people who think capitalism is a dirty word. They live in a state that is extremely high tax, extremely centralized, and more closely resembles maybe one of the more socialistic European nations than anything else. They're not exactly out in the middle of Texas shooting revolvers at the range on weekends. They're sitting there on their yoga mats on weekends and sleeping at their desks usually. By the way, these companies take taxpayer money and they platform government services. The biggest argument against the technological censorship that we have today, the biggest legal argument that can be made is almost never made. If Twitter is platforming the USGS and NOAA and giving out weather alerts, quake alerts, shit like that, tsunami warnings, all US citizens fundamentally have a right to enjoin that service. They have a right to follow that service and interact with it the same as any other citizen unless they're breaking US law and they have ceded some of their rights temporarily because of that, which is constitutional. That's okay. You can't have a firearm in prison, so to speak. That's the only reason why they should be kicked off, at least for US citizens. I'm not talking about people under EU law, people in fucking Australia or Brazil or something. It'd be nice, the internet should be US-centric. All of these sites should be pressured. What I'm saying is, the best outcome is strictly voluntary. That is that the trusts, they can remain in place. Who gives a damn if Google remains hegemonic? But they should be pressured by the people to conform only to US law and to not censor things outside of that framework. They should not conform to the UN Convention on Bullshit. They should not conform to the UK's Ministry of Bullshit. That shouldn't be happening. They are US firms, and Congress here should put pressure on them too. And by the way, to Holt, I would ask this. You're insinuating, I guess, that if you're like capitalistic or something, you support corporate censorship because reasons. Where are all the leftists coming out against censorship? Because the only person on the left, the only self-proclaimed like liberal that I can think of that is on the opposite side of the censorship debate from big tech, the only person I can think of is Bill Maher. That's the only one. I'm sure that I'm wrong. I'm sure that there are other people they're liberal, socialist, whatever, that don't believe in tech censorship. I'm sure you can find some examples, but they seem to be fairly scarce. Meanwhile, mainline Republicans, including many of them that I don't even like as people because politically I'm not exactly on their side, if you know what I'm saying, they're railing against tech censorship. In part because it's been rumored that it's against conservatives. I don't see it that way. I see it as just corporate censorship. It's been against the left, the right, and the center for a very long time, and it always will be. And it's very funny to see, some average, like, I guess, middle classer like Holt, again, in essence, defending corporate censorship, it seems, on a fairly regular basis simply because of his parent company's fiscal ties to the Open Society Foundation or something, I guess. It's very interesting. That's about all. Peace out.